Craig was watching the minor league baseball game. The Belleville Bears were beating the Raytown Raiders 4-3 behind the counter of the convenience store on Peters Avenue when his nightmare started. The demon entered as the guise of a man wielding a gun, his face hidden by a bandana and aviator glasses. Behind the mask, he was screaming. "Put your hands up and don't even think about pressing that alarm," yelled the intruder. He had the gun from his pocket trained on Craig as he approached the counter. "Oh, okay," stuttered Craig, who slowly raised his hands and took a step back towards the shelf which locked the plethora of cigarettes they sold. "Empty the cash register," demanded the man with the gun. He was wearing a heavy coat, but was short and skinnier otherwise. Clumsily, Craig began fumbling with the register, attempting to reach the contents of the drawer. "Hurry it up," screamed the man, waving the gun in Craig's face. Craig took a handful of 20s from the register, extending it toward the demon, who took the money greedily. "I suggest you leave before you do something we'll both regret," said a new masked man who appeared out of nowhere. He was in all black except for a dark red vest, gloves, and the part of his mask over his eyes. In his hand was a long silver blade which he held firmly against the robber's throat. Craig swallowed hard. He did not imagine the situation could get any worse. But now there were two masked men with weapons. "What are you gonna do?" asked the man with the gun. His voice was unsteady, and beads of sweat appeared on his brow. "If you kill him, I'll kill you," calmly replied the man wielding the knife. "And you want the money too?" asked the robber, the sweat now rolling down his face. "I only care about his life," replied the man in red. Craig watched the thief contemplate his options, then bolt for and out the door. He and the red-masked man watched the robber flee the store's parking lot and vanish down the dark alley across the street. Craig's fears returned when his eyes met those behind the mask. They were calm and cold with purpose and strength. "Give me your security footage," the man said. Craig, his hands still shaking, ejected the tape from the VCR behind the desk. He handed it to the man, who opened it with his knife, tossed the film in an empty garbage can, and ignited it with a match. "I was never here," he said, turning to leave. Craig mustered up his nerve and asked, Who are you?" The man stopped at the doorway between the cases of beer and the chips. Craig's heart rate increased, and he could feel his head becoming lighter. "Red Rebel," answered the stranger, before leaving and disappearing into the cold night. Craig breathed a sigh of relief and nearly collapsed onto the counter. "Thank you," he whispered, both to his savior and his God. 30 for a gram is a ripoff, yelled Big Joe, towering over the kid he was trying to buy some juice from. Juice was a new synthetic drug that was quickly becoming the hottest item to hit the suburbs of Belleville. 30 is a deal, Big Joe, replied Mike, an overly confident kid who was under the impression that he ruled the block. "I sold it to Bobby J for 36. They stood on the sidewalk of a quiet suburban street in the middle of the night. Big Joe, named so because of his height, wore a long trench coat and hat, making him seem even taller. Mike was short without standing next to Big Joe with a sweater on. "I can go buy from Sally across town for 25, argued Joe. "The stuff Sally sells is crap. This stuff has more of the good stuff than hers," bragged Mike. "And she's all the way across town, but hey, if you want to go find her for the cheaper juice, be my guest." Mike had turned to leave when he felt a hand on his shoulder. His lips creased to a smile as he pivoted, expecting to see Big Joe desperate for his fix. Instead, he saw the masked urban legend, Red Rebel. You're him," started Mike, his voice cracking. "Give me the drugs," said Red Rebel to Mike. "And you, give me the cash," he said to Big Joe. "All of it." Red Rebel stood unarmed between the buyer and the dealer. Mike reached into his pocket and was quick to produce a gun, which he pointed at the mask. "Back off or I'll shoot," he yelled. "Go ahead," said Red Rebel, not moving. "You don't think I will?" asked Mike, desperation behind his words. "Not with the safety on," said Red Rebel. Mike turned the gun to check the safety, but in that instant Red Rebel had thrust his hand to the gun, causing Mike to whack his head with the barrel and fire a shot into the air. At the same moment, Big Joe took a hold of Red Rebel, but the masked man had enough time to take the gun from Mike, turn it on Joe, and fire a shot which struck Joe's foot. Red Rebel stood, the gun in his hand, over Big Joe, who was whimpering, nursing his bleeding foot, and Mike, who was crying, his tears mixing with the blood flowing from the wound above his eye. "The juice," said Red Rebel to Mike. "And the money," he said to Big Joe. Both man and boy fished the goods from their pockets and tossed them at Red Rebel's feet. The vigilante retrieved the money, then took a match and set fire to the drugs. Mike whimpered at the sight of the burning drugs. Red Rebel walked to the car at the corner of the street, shattered the window with the butt of the handgun, unlocked the door, and climbed in. "Hey," cried Mike, "that's my car." But he was drowned out by the engine as Red Rebel turned over the engine, jammed the old car into gear, and peeled out, vanishing into the night. Standing on the sidewalk was a man, Polly, in a bathrobe and slippers. His hands were in his pockets, and he was shivering in the chilled night air. He moved from the wall of the hotel to the side of the street when a black car with tinted windows flashed its lights and pulled out of traffic. The car stopped so the back door was even with Polly, who bent over as the window descended. "I'll have the final product for you in 4 days, Key," said Polly, playing with a screwdriver in his pocket. "And I will give you the rest of the money then," said Key, the mysterious man in the car, wearing his traditional white suit. There was another man, clad in black, who sat beside Key in the car. "Have you heard the rumors?" asked Polly, trying to get a look at the other man in the car. "Just an urban legend, I'm happy to say," chuckled Key. "This is my city, and some fairy tale is not going to stop me or you. Now I will be by in 4 days for my product." "Yes, sir, Mr. Key," said Polly. The car pulled into traffic while Polly retreated into the hotel. Polly unlocked his room door and entered before flipping the light switch. On the desk was his month's work, nearly complete. He smiled at the thought of holding $100,000 in his hand. The bomb sat on the lone table at the end of the run-down hotel room. There was also a bed, a chair, and a dresser with a television upon it. "Such a nice-looking device," said a voice from nowhere. Polly's smile vanished. He snatched a knife from the plate of half-eaten steak. Waving the knife in the air, he backed himself up against his work. Who's there?" he feebly asked. "I think you know," answered the voice. "The Red Rebel?" he asked. From the shadows, the red-masked urban legend appeared with a gun in his hand. "Yes," said Red Rebel, slowly advancing toward Polly. "Stay back or I'll trigger it," yelled Polly, desperate. Just as Polly turned to take hold of the wire, which, if cut, would ignite the bomb, Red Rebel squeezed his own trigger. Polly dropped the knife, falling to the floor, his hand covering his bleeding shoulder. Red Rebel stepped over Polly, took the bomb, and left via the window as the maid began banging at the door. Red Rebel stood on a dock with the downtown skyline of Belleville beyond the shipping yard. With ease, he tossed the elaborate homemade bomb into the lake. "One day I will have to answer for the things I've done," he thought to himself. "It could be to a loved one, to a higher power, or maybe even to myself. But my actions are needed. There are too many innocent victims in the city. I know I cannot save them all, but I will try. By any means necessary, I will try."